Welcome to another peaceful journey through history, where we'll explore one of the most fascinating and complex figures to ever hold power in China. Tonight, we're diving deep into the extraordinary life of Empress Dowager Cixi, a woman who rose from humble concubine to become the de facto ruler of the Qing dynasty for nearly half a century. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend this time with me as we uncover the remarkable story of China's last great empress and the twilight of imperial rule. The year was 1835, and in the bustling streets of Beijing, few could have imagined that a young girl named Yehanara would one day control the fate of over 400 million people. Born into a Manchu family of modest means, her father served as a minor government official, a position that provided respectability but little wealth. The Yehanara clan belonged to the Bordered Blue Banner, one of the 8 administrative divisions that organized Manchu society, but their banner status offered more prestige than prosperity. As dawn broke over the Forbidden City each morning, young Yehanara would have awakened in her family's courtyard home, the sound of vendors calling their wares already echoing through the narrow hutongs. Her daily routine began before sunrise, as was customary for girls of her social standing. She would kneel before the ancestral shrine in the main hall, lighting incense and offering prayers to the spirits of her forebears, the sweet smoke curling upward as she whispered requests for protection and guidance. The morning light would filter through the paper windows as she prepared for her lessons. Unlike many girls of her era, Yehanara received an unusually comprehensive education. Her tutors, elderly scholars, with long white beards and ink-stained fingers, would arrive carrying leather satchels filled with classical texts. She learned to read and write both Manchu and Chinese characters, her brush moving gracefully across rice paper as she practiced the flowing strokes that would later sign imperial edicts. Her education extended far beyond mere literacy. She studied the classics of Chinese literature, memorizing passages from the Analects of Confucius and the poetry of Li Bai. But perhaps most importantly for her future, she learned the intricate protocols of court etiquette, the subtle art of reading facial expressions and body language that would serve her well in the treacherous world of palace politics. Her tutors taught her calligraphy, painting, and music, skills considered essential for any young woman who might one day enter the imperial household. The afternoons brought different lessons. While other girls her age might spend their time playing in courtyards or helping with household chores, Yehanara devoted herself to understanding the complexities of governance and administration. She would sit quietly in corners when her father entertained guests, absorbing conversations about taxation policies, military campaigns, and the delicate balance of power between the Manchu rulers and their Chinese subjects. As evening approached, the family would gather for dinner in the main hall, sitting around low tables laden with simple but nourishing fare. Steamed buns, pickled vegetables, and thin soups made from whatever ingredients were available formed the basis of their meals. During these family gatherings, Yehanara listened intently to discussions about current events, the rising influence of foreign powers, and the growing challenges facing the Qing dynasty. Her childhood was marked by an acute awareness of her family's precarious position in society. The Manchus, despite ruling China for nearly 2 centuries, remained a minority population governing a vast Chinese majority. This reality shaped every aspect of daily life, from the clothes they wore to the languages they spoke. Yehanara learned early that survival required not just intelligence and beauty, but an almost supernatural ability to navigate between different worlds and competing loyalties. The turning point in her young life came in 1851, when Emperor Xianfeng ascended to the throne and issued the traditional call for young Manchu women to present themselves for potential selection as imperial concubines. For families like the Yehanaras, this represented both an extraordinary opportunity and a terrifying risk. Success could elevate their entire clan to positions of wealth and influence, but failure or disgrace could result in exile or worse. At 16, Yehanara possessed the beauty, education, and poise necessary to catch imperial attention. But she also understood that thousands of other young women shared similar qualifications. The selection process would be brutal, with layer upon layer of evaluation designed to identify not just the most attractive candidates, but those with the intelligence and character to thrive in the complex ecosystem of the Forbidden City. The morning she departed for the Imperial selection, Yehanara rose before dawn to perform her final prayers at the family shrine. Her mother helped her dress in her finest silk robes, deep blue fabric embroidered with delicate patterns of chrysanthemums and butterflies. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style befitting her station, held in place with jade hairpins that had been passed down through generations of Yehanara women. The journey to the Forbidden City took her through streets she had known all her life. But now they seemed different, charged with possibility and danger. Vendors hawked their wares as usual, children played in the dust, and elderly men sat outside tea houses discussing the affairs of the day. But for Yehanara, this familiar world was already becoming part of her past. Upon entering the vast complex of the Forbidden City, she found herself in a realm that operated according to rules and customs that had been refined over centuries. Every gesture, every word, every glance carried meaning that could determine the trajectory of entire lives. The halls and courtyards were filled with hundreds of other young women, each hoping to capture the attention of an emperor they had never seen and might never meet. The initial selection process was methodical and impersonal. Palace eunuchs, men who had sacrificed their masculinity for positions of power and influence within the imperial household, evaluated each candidate according to strict criteria. Height, weight, facial features, skin quality, and deportment were all assessed with scientific precision. Women who failed to meet physical standards were dismissed immediately, sent back to their families with small gifts that served as consolation prizes for their participation. Those who survived the initial screening faced increasingly complex evaluations. They were tested on their knowledge of literature, history, and court protocol. They demonstrated their skills in calligraphy, painting, and musical performance. Most challenging of all, they were observed during carefully orchestrated social interactions designed to reveal their personalities, intelligence, and potential for political intrigue. Yehanara excelled in every phase of the selection process. Her tutors had prepared her well for the academic examinations, but more importantly, she possessed an intuitive understanding of human psychology that allowed her to present herself as exactly what each evaluator was seeking. She was demure enough to appear properly submissive, intelligent enough to demonstrate her value, and beautiful enough to capture attention without seeming threatening to other candidates. The final selection was made by the emperor himself, though the process remained shrouded in mystery and ceremony. Yehanara, along with the other successful candidates, was presented to Emperor Xianfeng in a formal audience that lasted only minutes, but would determine the rest of her life. The emperor, a young man struggling with the enormous burdens of ruling a vast empire during a period of unprecedented challenge, made his choices based on criteria that remained known only to him. When the results were announced, Yehanara found herself elevated to the rank of noble lady, a mid-level position in the complex hierarchy of imperial concubines. She was assigned new quarters within the Forbidden City, given a household of servants and attendants, and granted a monthly allowance that exceeded her family's annual income. But she also understood that this was only the beginning of a much longer and more dangerous journey. Her new apartments were luxurious by any standard, with silk tapestries covering the walls, carved furniture made from precious woods, and windows that looked out onto carefully manicured gardens. Yet they were also a prison, surrounded by high walls and guarded by eunuchs whose loyalty was to the imperial system rather than to any individual concubine. She could not leave without permission, could not correspond with her family without supervision, and could not make any significant decisions about her own life without approval from higher authorities. The daily routine of imperial concubines was strictly regulated, designed to maintain order and hierarchy within a system that housed hundreds of women in close proximity. Yehanara would wake each morning to the sound of bells echoing across the Forbidden City, signaling the beginning of another day in service to the emperor and the dynasty. She would dress with the assistance of her personal maids, selecting robes and jewelry appropriate to her rank and the day's planned activities. Mornings were typically devoted to personal cultivation and education. She continued her studies in literature and history, but now her education was supplemented with detailed instruction in court protocol and imperial traditions. She learned the precise gestures required for different types of formal greetings, the appropriate responses to various imperial communications, and the subtle signals used to navigate the complex social dynamics of palace life. The afternoons brought opportunities for artistic expression and social interaction with other concubines, though these activities were carefully supervised to prevent the formation of potentially dangerous alliances or conspiracies. Yehanara would practice her calligraphy in the garden pavilions, her brush moving across silk scrolls as she composed poems about the changing seasons and the melancholy beauty of palace life. The sound of water trickling from ornamental fountains provided a peaceful backdrop for her creative work, while the scent of jasmine and lotus blossoms filled the air during the warmer months. Her artistic pursuits served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. Each painting she created, every poem she composed, and all her musical performances were evaluated by palace officials who reported on the cultural accomplishments of imperial concubines. Excellence in these refined arts could lead to increased favor and status within the hierarchy, while mediocrity might result in being overlooked during imperial selections for private audiences or special ceremonies. The evening hours were perhaps the most challenging aspect of palace life, as they brought the possibility of being summoned to attend the emperor. These summons came without warning, delivered by eunuch messengers who would appear at her door with formal invitations written on yellow silk. When such a summons arrived, Yehanara would have only minutes to prepare herself, selecting the most appropriate robes and jewelry while her servants arranged her hair and applied the subtle cosmetics favored by the imperial court. The walk to the emperor's chambers took her through a maze of corridors and courtyards, each more magnificent than the last. Painted dragons coiled across ceiling beams, their golden eyes seeming to watch her progress. Carved jade screens depicted scenes from classical literature, while bronze incense burners filled the air with sandalwood and myrrh. The floors were covered with thick carpets woven in intricate patterns that told stories of ancient battles and legendary romances. Emperor Xianfeng was a complex and troubled young man, burdened by responsibilities that would have challenged even the most experienced ruler. He had inherited an empire facing unprecedented threats from both internal rebellion and foreign invasion. The Taiping Rebellion was devastating southern China, claiming millions of lives and threatening the very foundations of Qing rule. Meanwhile, British and French forces were pressing for greater access to Chinese markets and territory, backing their demands with modern weapons and military tactics that exposed the weakness of traditional Chinese defenses. During her private audiences with the emperor, Yehanara demonstrated not only the grace and beauty expected of an imperial concubine, but also an unusual interest in and understanding of political affairs. While other concubines entertained the emperor with music, poetry, or conversation about palace gossip, she asked thoughtful questions about military strategy, diplomatic negotiations, and administrative challenges facing the empire. This intellectual curiosity initially amused the emperor, but gradually he began to value her insights and seek her opinions on matters of state. Their relationship deepened over the months following her arrival at court. The emperor, isolated by his position and surrounded by advisors who often told him what they thought he wanted to hear, found in Yehanara someone who would engage with him as a person, rather than merely an imperial symbol. She learned to read his moods and temperament, understanding when he needed encouragement, when he required honest counsel, and when he simply wanted companionship, without the burden of formal protocol. The turning point in their relationship came during the winter of 1852, when Yehanara discovered she was pregnant with the emperor's child. In the rigid hierarchy of the imperial harem, bearing the emperor's offspring was the ultimate achievement for any concubine, instantly elevating her status and securing her position within the palace. But pregnancy also brought new dangers and complications, as the health of imperial children was a matter of dynastic survival, and any threat to their well-being could result in severe consequences for their mothers. The months of her pregnancy were marked by constant attention from imperial physicians, eunuch supervisors, and palace officials who monitored every aspect of her daily routine. Her diet was carefully regulated, with meals prepared according to ancient recipes believed to promote the health of unborn children. She was forbidden from engaging in any strenuous activities and was required to remain within designated areas of the palace where her safety could be guaranteed. During this period of enforced leisure, Yehanara spent increasing amounts of time studying the history and traditions of the Qing dynasty, preparing herself for the elevated role that motherhood would bring. She read biographical accounts of previous Empress dowagers who had wielded significant political influence, paying particular attention to the strategies they had used to maintain power and protect their interests. She also studied the complex relationships between the imperial court and the various factions of Chinese society, understanding that her future would depend on her ability to navigate these competing interests. The birth of her son in April 1856 transformed not only her personal circumstances, but also her relationship with Empress Yanfeng and her position within the broader political landscape of the empire. The infant prince was given the name Zai Chun and was immediately recognized as a potential heir to the imperial throne. For Yehanara, now elevated to the rank of imperial noble consort Yi, this meant security and influence beyond anything she could have imagined during her childhood in Beijing. However, the joy of motherhood was tempered by the increasingly dire situation facing the empire. The Taiping Rebellion continued to rage across southern China, with rebel forces advancing toward major cities and threatening vital economic resources. Foreign powers were becoming more aggressive in their demands for territorial concessions and trading privileges, while the imperial treasury struggled to fund both military campaigns and the elaborate ceremonies required to maintain the prestige of the dynasty. Empress Yanfeng's health began to deteriorate under the stress of governing during such turbulent times. He suffered from various ailments that palace physicians seemed unable to cure, spending long periods confined to his chambers and relying increasingly on trusted advisors to manage day-to-day administrative affairs. During these periods of imperial incapacitation, Yehanara found herself serving not only as companion and mother of his heir, but also as an informal advisor whose opinions carried significant weight in important decisions. Her growing influence within the palace created tension with other members of the imperial family and court officials who viewed her rapid rise with suspicion and resentment. The Empress, who had failed to produce any children despite years of marriage to the emperor, watched with particular concern as Yehanara's star continued to ascend. Other concubines who had once treated her as an equal now approached her with the deference due to someone whose son might one day rule the empire. The political dynamics of the palace reflected broader tensions within Chinese society during this period of unprecedented change and challenge. Traditional Confucian values emphasized hierarchy, stability, and respect for established authority. But these principles were being tested by military defeats, economic pressures, and social upheaval that threatened the very foundations of imperial rule. Foreign ideas about government, technology, and social organization were beginning to penetrate Chinese society, creating debates about whether the empire should embrace modernization or resist foreign influence. As 1860 approached, these various pressures would converge in ways that would transform not only Yehanara's personal circumstances, but also the entire trajectory of Chinese history. The woman who had entered the Forbidden City as a teenage concubine was about to face challenges that would test every skill she had developed and every alliance she had cultivated during her rise through the palace hierarchy. The crisis that would define Yehanara's destiny began with distant cannon fire echoing across the hills surrounding Beijing. In October 1860, British and French forces had marched inland from the coast, their modern rifles and artillery cutting through Qing defences like silk. Emperor Xianfeng paced the marble floors of his private study, his silk slippers making barely a whisper as he moved between windows that looked out onto courtyards where courtiers whispered in hushed, frightened tones. Yehanara sat quietly in the corner of the Imperial chamber, her 4-year-old son Zaichun playing with wooden toys at her feet, while she embroidered a silk screen with trembling fingers. The sound of her needle piercing the delicate fabric provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the Emperor's anxious breathing. Outside, the autumn leaves had turned golden and crimson, but their beauty seemed mocked by the smoke rising from burning villages on the horizon. The Emperor's morning routine had become increasingly erratic as reports arrived of foreign armies advancing toward the capital. Instead of the traditional dawn ceremonies in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, he now spent hours hunched over military dispatches that arrived throughout the night. His breakfast of congee and pickled vegetables sat untouched on lacquered trays while he studied maps spread across tables that had once held poetry scrolls and philosophical texts. Palace eunuchs moved through the corridors with unusual haste, their normally measured steps quickening as they carried messages between various government ministers who had taken up residence in chambers throughout the Forbidden City. The air was thick with the smoke from countless oil lamps that burned through the night as officials worked frantically to coordinate the Empire's response to this unprecedented crisis. Yehanara watched these developments with growing alarm, but also with the calculating mind that had served her so well during her rise through the palace hierarchy. She understood that the approaching foreign armies represented both a catastrophic threat and a potential opportunity for those clever enough to position themselves advantageously during the chaos that would inevitably follow. Her daily routine adapted to accommodate the new realities of palace life under siege. Instead of leisurely mornings devoted to poetry and painting, she now spent hours in consultation with her most trusted servants, gathering intelligence about the movements of court officials and the shifting alliances that were forming as the crisis deepened. Her quarters became an informal information centre where loyal eunuchs shared gossip and rumours that might prove valuable in the days ahead. The afternoons brought increasingly desperate war councils, where Emperor Xianfeng met with his advisors to debate impossible choices. Should they attempt to defend Beijing against the foreign armies? Should they negotiate from a position of weakness? Should they abandon the capital entirely and establish a government in exile, somewhere beyond the reach of foreign artillery? Yehanara listened from behind silk screens that allowed her to observe these crucial discussions while maintaining the appearance of proper feminine seclusion. During these council sessions, she witnessed the emperor's gradual transformation from an indecisive young ruler into a man paralyzed by the magnitude of the decisions facing him. His hands shook as he lifted teacups to his lips, and his voice cracked when he attempted to give orders that might determine the fate of millions of people. The traditional imperial robes seemed to hang loosely on his diminishing frame, as if the weight of the crisis was physically consuming him. The palace kitchens, which had once produced elaborate banquets featuring dozens of courses prepared by teams of specialized cooks, now operated in a state of barely controlled chaos. Food supplies were becoming increasingly scarce as trade routes were disrupted, and farmers fled their fields to escape the advancing armies. Yehanara's evening meals consisted of simple broths and steamed vegetables, a stark contrast to the sumptuous feasts that had marked special occasions during more peaceful times. Her son Zaichun, too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, continued his childhood routines with the resilience typical of children during times of adult crisis. He played with toy soldiers made from carved jade, unconsciously mimicking the real battles being fought just beyond the palace walls. His laughter provided moments of relief in chambers where adults spoke only in whispered consultations about strategies for survival. As October progressed, the foreign armies drew closer to Beijing, and Emperor Xianfeng made the fateful decision to abandon the capital. The announcement came during a pre-dawn meeting where the emperor, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow from sleepless nights, informed his closest advisors that the court would retreat to the mountain palace at Reihe, far from the reach of foreign cannons, but also far from the centers of power that had sustained the dynasty for centuries. The preparations for departure transformed the normally orderly palace into a scene of frantic activity. Servants rushed through corridors carrying trunks filled with imperial treasures, while eunuchs supervised the packing of documents and ceremonial objects that could not be left behind for foreign invaders to desecrate. Yehanara supervised her own household's preparations, making careful decisions about which personal possessions to take and which to abandon to an uncertain fate. The journey to Reihe began before sunrise on a cold morning when frost covered the courtyards and the breath of horses created clouds in the crisp air. The imperial procession stretched for miles along mountain roads that had been travelled by hunting parties during happier times, but now served as escape routes for a dynasty in retreat. Yehanara rode in a covered palanquin with her son, the silk curtains drawn against both the mountain wind and the possibility of recognition by hostile observers. The mountain palace at Reihe had been designed as a summer retreat where emperors could escape the heat and humidity of Beijing while enjoying hunting and other recreational activities. Its pavilions and gardens were beautiful but modest compared to the grandeur of the Forbidden City, and its facilities were entirely inadequate for housing the complete apparatus of imperial government during an extended period of exile. Yehanara's new quarters consisted of a simple suite of rooms overlooking a small garden where deer grazed among carefully tended pine trees. The furniture was elegant but sparse, and the heating system struggled to keep out the mountain cold that grew more severe as winter approached. She spent her mornings wrapped in thick quilts while her servants prepared tea over braziers that filled the rooms with the smoke of burning charcoal. The emperor's health deteriorated rapidly in the harsh mountain climate. His chronic illnesses were exacerbated by the stress of exile and the constant anxiety about the fate of his empire. He spent most days confined to his chambers, emerging only for brief walks in the garden when the weather permitted and his strength allowed. Palace physicians, working with limited supplies and facilities, struggled to treat ailments that might have been manageable in the better-equipped medical facilities of the Forbidden City. During these long days of imperial incapacitation, Yehanara found herself playing an increasingly important role in maintaining communication between the exiled court and government officials who had remained in Beijing or fled to other locations throughout the empire. Her intelligence networks, cultivated during her years in the palace, now proved invaluable for gathering information about political developments and military situations that the official channels seemed unable to monitor effectively. The winter of 1860 passed slowly in the mountain retreat, with news from the outside world arriving sporadically through messengers who struggled through snow-blocked passes to deliver reports that were often weeks out of date. The foreign armies had occupied Beijing and were systematically looting the summer palace, destroying treasures that had been accumulated over centuries of imperial patronage. Ancient libraries were burned, precious artifacts were stolen, and gardens that had been designed by master craftsmen were vandalized beyond recognition. Emperor Xianfeng received these reports with a mixture of rage and despair that seemed to accelerate his physical decline. He would spend hours staring out at the snow-covered mountains, his silence broken only by occasional outbursts of anger directed at advisors who brought him news of each fresh humiliation suffered by his empire. His appetite disappeared entirely, and his already thin frame became skeletal as he refused the simple meals that the mountain palace kitchens could provide. Yehanara watched this deterioration with growing alarm, understanding that the emperor's death would create a succession crisis that could either destroy her carefully built position or elevate her to unprecedented power. Her son Cixi was still a child, which meant that any regency government would require adult leadership capable of navigating the complex challenges facing the dynasty. The question was whether she would be included in such arrangements or marginalized by court officials who had never fully accepted her rapid rise through the palace hierarchy. The spring of 1861 brought warmer weather to the mountains, but no relief from the political pressures that were consuming the emperor's remaining strength. Peace negotiations with the foreign powers had resulted in treaties that imposed humiliating conditions on the Chinese government, including massive indemnity payments and the opening of additional ports to foreign trade. These agreements represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between China and the Western nations, acknowledging Chinese weakness in ways that challenged the very foundations of imperial legitimacy. Emperor Xianfeng's final weeks were marked by increasing delirium as his various illnesses overwhelmed his weakened constitution. He would alternate between periods of unconsciousness and moments of clarity, during which he attempted to address the question of succession and regency arrangements. Yehanara maintained a constant vigil at his bedside, ensuring that she was present during these lucid intervals when crucial decisions about the future of the dynasty might be made. The emperor's death on August 22, 1861, marked the end of one era and the beginning of another that would be defined by Yehanara's transformation from imperial concubine to the power behind the throne. The mountain palace, which had served as a refuge during the crisis of foreign invasion, now became the stage for a carefully orchestrated political drama that would determine whether the Qing dynasty could adapt to the new realities of the modern world or would collapse under the weight of internal conflict and external pressure. As the emperor's body lay in state in the main hall of the mountain palace, surrounded by incense burners and ceremonial guards, Yehanara began implementing plans she had been developing throughout the long months of exile. Her 5-year-old son was now Emperor Tongji, but the real question was who would exercise power during his minority, and according to what principles the empire would be governed during this period of unprecedented challenge and opportunity. The announcement of the new emperor's accession was made according to ancient protocols that seemed surreal in the mountain setting. Palace eunuchs dressed in formal court robes proclaimed 5-year-old Cixi as Emperor Tongji, while snow still clung to the pine branches outside the ceremonial halls. The child sat on a makeshift throne carved from local wood, his tiny frame dwarfed by imperial robes that had been hastily altered to fit his diminutive stature. Yehanara knelt beside her son during the ceremony, her head bowed in the traditional gesture of submission, but her mind was already racing through the complex calculations required to secure her position in the new political order. The assembled court officials, many of whom had spent months plotting their own advancement during the emperor's illness, watched her carefully for signs of weakness or uncertainty that they might exploit in the power struggles that would inevitably follow. The Regency Council that was supposed to govern during the young emperor's minority had been hastily assembled from officials who happened to be present at Reihe when Emperor Xianfeng died. This group included several princes of the blood who had legitimate claims to influence over imperial policy, as well as senior bureaucrats whose expertise in administration was considered essential for managing the empire's recovery from foreign invasion and internal rebellion. However, the regency arrangements contained a fatal flaw that Yehanara had recognized immediately. The council members were united only in their desire to exclude her from meaningful participation in government, despite her obvious influence over the child emperor and her demonstrated understanding of political affairs. They assumed that a woman, regardless of her intelligence or experience, could be safely marginalized, while they divided power among themselves according to traditional masculine hierarchies. This assumption would prove to be their undoing. Yehanara had spent years observing the dynamics of court politics, understanding not only the formal structures of imperial government, but also the informal networks of loyalty, obligation, and mutual interest that actually determined how decisions were made and implemented. She had cultivated relationships with key eunuchs, military officers, and provincial administrators who valued competence over gender and results over precedent. Her daily routine during the early weeks of the regency was carefully designed to appear submissive, while actually gathering intelligence and building coalitions that would support her eventual move to claim real authority. Each morning, she would dress in the simple robes appropriate to her status as Imperial Mother, avoiding any display of luxury or ambition that might alert her potential rivals to her true intentions. The breakfast ritual in her mountain quarters became an informal intelligence briefing where trusted servants shared gossip and observations about the activities of Regency Council members. Over bowls of thin congee flavored with preserved vegetables, she learned which officials were meeting privately, which alliances were forming, and which individuals might be persuaded to support alternative power arrangements. Her afternoons were ostensibly devoted to the education and care of the young emperor, but these teaching sessions also served as opportunities to demonstrate her indispensability to the imperial system. While other adults struggled to communicate with the child in ways he could understand, Yehanara had developed techniques for explaining complex political concepts through stories and games that engaged his natural curiosity while preparing him for his future responsibilities. The young Emperor Tongji would sit cross-legged on silk cushions in her chambers while she told him tales of ancient rulers who had faced challenges similar to those confronting the Qing dynasty. These stories were carefully chosen to emphasize themes of loyalty, wisdom, and the importance of listening to advisors who demonstrated genuine concern for imperial welfare rather than personal advancement. During these educational sessions, Yehanara would also teach her son to recognize the subtle signs of deception and manipulation that characterized court politics. She showed him how to read facial expressions, interpret tone of voice, and understand the hidden meanings behind formal speeches. These lessons were presented as games, but they provided the child emperor with skills that would prove essential for navigating the treacherous world of imperial decision-making. The evening meals in the mountain palace had become tense affairs, where Regency Council members attempted to present a facade of unity while actually maneuvering for individual advantage. Yehanara attended these dinners in her capacity as Imperial Mother, sitting in a position that appeared subordinate but actually allowed her to observe the interactions between different faction leaders. She watched as Prince Sushun, the most ambitious member of the Regency Council, attempted to establish himself as the dominant figure in the new government through a combination of legal arguments about his constitutional authority and subtle intimidation of potential rivals. His speeches during these formal dinners were masterpieces of political rhetoric, combining appeals to tradition with promises of effective governance that were designed to win support from undecided officials. However, Yehanara also noticed the growing resentment among other council members who recognized that Prince Sushun's success would come at the expense of their own influence and ambitions. The careful balance of interests that held the regency together was becoming increasingly unstable as each member pursued strategies that inevitably conflicted with the goals of their supposed allies. The autumn of 1861 brought news from Beijing that the foreign occupying forces had finally withdrawn, allowing Chinese officials to return to the capital and begin the process of restoring normal governmental operations. This development created pressure for the imperial court to end its exile and return to the Forbidden City. But it also created opportunities for dramatic changes in the political arrangements that had been established during the mountain retreat. The journey back to Beijing was organized as a formal imperial procession designed to demonstrate the restoration of Qing authority and the continuity of dynastic rule despite the humiliations of the previous year. Yehanara rode in a covered palanquin with the young emperor, their vehicle positioned in the center of a column that stretched for miles along the mountain roads leading back to the capital. The procession moved slowly through villages where local populations lined the roads to catch glimpses of their returning rulers. Many of these spectators showed visible signs of the hardships they had endured during the foreign occupation, their clothes patched and worn, their faces marked by hunger and anxiety. Yet they still performed the traditional gestures of respect, kneeling and kowtowing as the imperial party passed. For Yehanara, this journey provided crucial opportunities to assess the mood of the population and the loyalty of local officials who had managed to survive the recent upheavals. She observed everything through the gauze curtains of her palanquin, noting which regions showed signs of effective administration and which appeared to be suffering from neglect or corruption. The return to the Forbidden City in early November was marked by elaborate ceremonies designed to restore the psychological impact of imperial authority. The great gates were thrown open for the first time in over a year, and the courtyards were filled with officials and servants who had either remained in the capital throughout the occupation or had returned from various refugees to resume their duties. Yehanara's quarters in the Forbidden City had been maintained throughout the period of exile, but they seemed different now, charged with new possibilities and dangers. The familiar pavilions and gardens looked exactly as they had when she left, yet the political landscape had shifted so dramatically that even unchanged physical spaces felt transformed by altered circumstances. The young emperor's routine was carefully re-established according to traditional protocols, but with modifications that reflected the new realities of his position and the Regency government's authority. His daily schedule included formal audiences with council members, educational sessions with imperial tutors, and ceremonial appearances that were designed to demonstrate the continuity of legitimate rule. However, Yehanara ensured that she maintained private access to her son during the crucial transition periods between these official activities. These informal moments allowed her to provide the child with alternative perspectives on the information he received from other sources, helping him develop the critical thinking skills that would be essential for effective leadership once he reached maturity. The winter of 1861 passed in an atmosphere of surface calm that masked growing tensions within the Regency government. The various council members had returned to familiar surroundings where they could operate according to established routines, but the fundamental contradictions in their power-sharing arrangement became more apparent as they attempted to address the serious challenges facing the empire. The financial situation was particularly dire, with the imperial treasury depleted by war expenses and indemnity payments to foreign powers. Traditional revenue sources had been disrupted by military campaigns and economic dislocation, while new expenses continued to mount as the government struggled to restore effective administration throughout the empire. Prince Sushun attempted to address these fiscal challenges through a combination of increased taxation and reduced expenditures that inevitably created conflicts with other interest groups within the imperial system. His proposals for administrative reform were rational from an economic perspective, but they threatened the positions and privileges of countless officials whose support was necessary for implementing any major policy changes. Yehanara watched these developments with growing confidence that the Regency Council's internal contradictions would eventually create opportunities for her to assert greater authority. She began preparing for this possibility by strengthening her relationships with key military commanders, whose loyalty would be essential during any transition period. Her approach to military politics was characteristically subtle and indirect. Rather than openly courting the support of army officers, she focused on demonstrating her understanding of strategic and logistical challenges facing Chinese forces in various theaters of operation. Her questions during informal conversations revealed genuine knowledge of military affairs that impressed professional soldiers who had become accustomed to dealing with court officials whose expertise was purely theoretical. The spring of 1862 brought a series of crises that tested the Regency government's ability to respond effectively to unexpected challenges. Rebellions erupted in several provinces where local populations had been pushed beyond their limits by taxation and conscription policies. Foreign merchants in treaty ports complained about irregular enforcement of commercial agreements, threatening renewed international conflicts that the weakened empire could not afford. Most seriously, reports arrived from the southern provinces indicating that Taiping rebel forces were preparing new offensives that could threaten major cities and vital economic resources. The Regency Council's response to these multiple challenges revealed both the limitations of collective decision-making and the personal ambitions that were undermining governmental unity. Different council members advocated for incompatible strategies that reflected their individual priorities rather than comprehensive analysis of imperial interests. Prince Cixi favored military solutions that would demonstrate strength but required resources the government did not possess. Other officials recommended diplomatic approaches that might preserve imperial finances but could be interpreted as signs of weakness by both domestic and foreign observers. These policy debates provided Yehanara with detailed intelligence about the thinking and capabilities of each Regency Council member. She used this information to develop strategies for exploiting their disagreements, while positioning herself as a source of alternative leadership that could provide the unity and decisiveness that collective governance seemed unable to achieve. Her daily routine during this period of mounting crisis was carefully structured to maintain the appearance of appropriate feminine submission, while actually building the foundation for dramatic political action. Each morning began with private prayers in her personal shrine, where she sought guidance from ancestral spirits about the timing and methods for asserting her authority. The breakfast conferences with trusted servants became increasingly focused on operational planning rather than mere intelligence gathering. Maps of the Forbidden City were spread across her dining table as loyal eunuchs explained the locations of key government offices, military installations, and communication centers that would need to be controlled during any transition of power. Her afternoon sessions with the young emperor took on new urgency as she prepared him psychologically for the possibility of major changes in the governmental arrangements that surrounded him. These conversations were presented as lessons about Chinese history and political philosophy, but they were actually designed to help the child understand and accept his mother's eventual emergence as the real authority behind imperial decision-making. The evening hours were devoted to coded communications with military commanders and provincial officials, whose support would be crucial during the critical moment when she chose to move against the Regency Council. These messages were carefully crafted to appear as routine correspondence about administrative matters, but they actually contained specific instructions about actions to be taken when predetermined signals were given. By midsummer 1862, Yehanara had completed the preparations for what would become known as the Xinyu coup, a carefully orchestrated political maneuver that would transform her from marginalized imperial mother into the most powerful person in the Chinese Empire. The Regency Council members remained focused on their own factional struggles, unaware that their most dangerous opponent was the woman they had dismissed as politically irrelevant. The timing of her move was determined by a convergence of factors that created optimal conditions for success while minimizing the risks of failure or retaliation. A major military crisis in the southern provinces had drawn several key council members away from Beijing, reducing the immediate opposition she would face. Financial pressures had created widespread dissatisfaction among court officials, who were becoming receptive to alternative leadership arrangements. Most importantly, intelligence reports indicated that foreign powers were preparing new demands that would require decisive governmental response. The coup itself unfolded during a single night in November 1862, executed with precision that reflected months of careful planning and coordination. Trusted military units simultaneously secured key locations throughout the Forbidden City, while loyal officials took control of communication systems and government archives. Prince Cixi and his primary allies were arrested on charges of corruption and incompetence, effectively decapitating the Regency Council without creating opportunities for organized resistance. The morning after the coup found Yehanara installed as Empress Dowager Cixi, the official title that would define her public identity for the remainder of her remarkable career. The young Emperor Tongji remained on the throne, but real authority now rested with the woman who had transformed herself from concubine to regent through a combination of intelligence, patience, and ruthless political calculation. The announcement of the new governmental arrangements was made during a formal court ceremony where assembled officials witnessed the installation of Empress Dowager Cixi as co-regent alongside Empress Dowager Xian, the deceased emperor's principal wife. This power-sharing arrangement provided constitutional legitimacy, while ensuring that Cixi would have decisive influence over all major policy decisions. The first weeks of her regency were devoted to consolidating control over the governmental apparatus and demonstrating that the transition had strengthened rather than weakened imperial authority. She moved quickly to address the most pressing military and financial challenges facing the empire, implementing policies that had been delayed or compromised by the indecisiveness of collective leadership. Her daily routine as Empress Dowager was carefully designed to project authority while maintaining the ceremonial protocols that were essential for legitimacy in the eyes of traditional court culture. Each morning began with formal audiences, where she received reports from government ministers and issued instructions about policy implementation. These sessions were conducted from behind a yellow silk screen that maintained appropriate gender separation, while allowing her to participate fully in governmental decision-making. The transformation of Yehanara into Empress Dowager Cixi represented more than just a change in political leadership. It marked the beginning of a new era in Chinese history, one in which traditional assumptions about gender, power, and political authority would be challenged and redefined by the extraordinary capabilities of a woman who had refused to accept the limitations that society had attempted to impose upon her ambitions. The afternoon sun filtered through the latticed windows of Cixi's private study as she prepared for what would become her defining moment as sole ruler of China. The year was 1865, and the young Emperor Tongji had reached an age where courtiers whispered about reducing her regency powers. But Cixi understood that relinquishing control would mean not just personal exile, but the collapse of the reforms she had begun implementing to save the dynasty from complete destruction. Her morning routine had evolved into a carefully orchestrated display of imperial authority that would have been unthinkable for any woman just decades earlier. She would rise before dawn in her chambers within the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility, her personal residence that had become the unofficial center of Chinese government. The sound of her silk slippers against the polished wooden floors echoed through corridors where eunuchs waited with reports from across the empire. The ritual of dressing required nearly an hour, as layers of imperial yellow robes were arranged with mathematical precision. Each garment carried symbolic meaning that reinforced her legitimacy. The phoenix embroidered across her chest represented feminine imperial power, while the dragons coiling around her sleeves demonstrated her authority over the masculine forces of government and military. Her elaborate headdress, adorned with pearls and jade ornaments, added nearly a foot to her height, ensuring that she towered over male officials who knelt in her presence. Breakfast was served on porcelain dishes, decorated with scenes from classical literature, each piece worth more than most Chinese families earned in a lifetime. But Cixi barely touched the delicate pastries and fragrant teas placed before her, her appetite suppressed by the constant pressure of decisions that could affect millions of lives. Instead, she used the morning meal as an opportunity to review intelligence reports that arrived throughout the night from her vast network of informants. These intelligence summaries painted a picture of an empire still teetering on the edge of collapse. The Taiping Rebellion had finally been crushed, but at enormous cost in both lives and resources. Foreign powers continued to demand concessions that eroded Chinese sovereignty, while internal corruption undermined every attempt at administrative reform. Most concerning were reports of growing resentment among traditional court officials, who viewed her continued regency as a violation of proper Confucian order. Her morning audiences took place in the Hall of Mental Cultivation, where she sat behind an ornate screen that allowed her to see petitioners while maintaining the fiction that she was merely advising her son. Government ministers would kneel before the empty throne where young Emperor Tongji sat in rigid silence, while Cixi's voice emerged from behind the yellow silk barrier with commands that carried the full weight of imperial authority. These daily sessions revealed the staggering complexity of governing an empire that stretched from the frozen steppes of Mongolia to the tropical ports of southern China. Provincial governors requested emergency funding for flood relief along the Yellow River. Military commanders sought authorization for campaigns against bandits who threatened trade routes. Diplomatic officials required guidance on negotiations with European powers, whose technological superiority made traditional Chinese responses inadequate. Cixi's responses demonstrated a grasp of practical governance that impressed even her harshest critics. She had taught herself to read detailed financial reports that tracked revenue flows from dozens of different tax sources. Her questions about military logistics revealed understanding of supply chains, troop movements, and strategic planning that rivaled professional officers. Most remarkably, her diplomatic instructions showed sophisticated comprehension of international law and commercial agreements that had been imposed on China during its period of weakness. The complexity of her position required Cixi to master multiple roles simultaneously. As regent, she needed to demonstrate unwavering loyalty to her son, while actually exercising supreme authority. As a woman, she had to project appropriate feminine virtues while commanding masculine institutions of government and warfare. As a Manchu, she needed to maintain the ethnic hierarchy that kept her people in power, while governing a vast Chinese population that outnumbered Manchus by hundreds to one. Her afternoon schedule was devoted to private meetings with key officials who required more detailed consultation than the formal morning audiences could provide. These sessions took place in intimate pavilions scattered throughout her residential complex, where the informal atmosphere encouraged honest discussion about sensitive political matters. The sound of water trickling through ornamental rock gardens provided a peaceful backdrop for conversations about military strategy, economic policy, and diplomatic negotiations. During these private consultations, Cixi demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt her communication style to the personality and interests of each visitor. With military commanders, she spoke the direct language of soldiers, asking pointed questions about troop readiness and strategic objectives. With financial officials, she displayed detailed knowledge of accounting principles and revenue projections that allowed her to identify inefficiencies and corruption. With foreign diplomats, she employed subtle verbal fencing that advanced Chinese interests while avoiding confrontations that could trigger military retaliation. The garden walks that occupied her late afternoons served multiple purposes beyond simple exercise and relaxation. The carefully designed landscapes provided settings for informal encounters with court officials who might be reluctant to express controversial opinions during formal audiences. The winding paths between artificial hills and ornamental lakes created opportunities for seemingly chance meetings that were actually carefully orchestrated to gather intelligence or send political messages. These garden conversations revealed the depth of Cixi's understanding of human psychology and political motivation. She would discuss poetry with scholarly officials while subtly probing their views on governmental reform. She would admire flower arrangements with palace ladies while gathering gossip about the activities of potential rivals. She would feed goldfish in ornamental ponds while conducting negotiations with eunuch administrators who controlled access to sensitive information. Her evening meals had evolved into working dinners, where selected guests joined her for discussions that continued the day's political business in a more relaxed atmosphere. The dining room in her private apartments featured round tables that encouraged conversation among participants who might normally interact only through formal protocols. The menu always included dishes from different regions of the empire, a subtle reminder of the diversity that made China both powerful and difficult to govern. These dinner conversations allowed Cixi to observe the personal dynamics between different officials while also testing policy ideas in informal settings where participants might express opinions they would never voice during formal meetings. She would pose hypothetical questions about administrative reforms while studying facial expressions and body language for signs of support or resistance. She would describe foreign technological innovations while gauging reactions from officials whose cooperation would be necessary for implementing modernization programs. The evening hours also provided opportunities for Cixi to continue her own education in subjects that were essential for effective governance, but had not been included in the traditional curriculum for imperial women. Her personal library contained treatises on military engineering, international law, and economic theory that she studied with the dedication of a scholar preparing for imperial examinations. The margins of these books were filled with her handwritten notes and observations that revealed a mind constantly seeking to understand and master new forms of knowledge. Her correspondence occupied several hours each evening as she maintained personal relationships with officials throughout the empire, whose loyalty and competence were essential for implementing her policies. These letters were carefully crafted to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously. They provided specific instructions about administrative matters, while also reinforcing personal bonds of loyalty and obligation. They conveyed imperial authority, while also demonstrating genuine interest in the welfare and career advancement of their recipients. The letters Cixi wrote to provincial governors combined detailed policy guidance with personal touches that acknowledged the unique challenges facing each region. Her correspondence with military commanders balanced strategic directives with recognition of their professional expertise and battlefield achievements. Her communications with foreign diplomats employed sophisticated language that advanced Chinese negotiating positions while maintaining the ceremonial courtesies required for international relations. The complexity of maintaining these extensive correspondence networks required Cixi to employ teams of secretaries and translators whose absolute discretion was ensured through a combination of generous rewards and severe penalties for betrayal. These trusted assistants worked in shifts throughout the night, preparing drafts of letters and documents that Cixi would review and modify according to her personal knowledge of the recipients and current political circumstances. Her private chambers during these evening work sessions resembled a military command center more than the traditional boudoir of an imperial concubine. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins that tracked the movements of armies, rebellions, and foreign expeditions. Tables were covered with stacks of reports from intelligence agents, diplomatic cables from foreign capitals, and financial summaries from provincial administrations. The oil lamps that illuminated these late-night strategy sessions cast dancing shadows across documents that recorded the pulse of an empire struggling to adapt to revolutionary changes in technology, economics, and international relations. Cixi would move between different workstations like a general coordinating multiple campaigns, her silk robes rustling as she consulted reference materials and drafted responses to the constant stream of crises that required immediate attention. Her personal servants, mostly elderly eunuchs who had served in the palace for decades, moved silently through these nighttime work sessions, bringing tea and light snacks, while maintaining the absolute silence that allowed Cixi to concentrate on problems that could determine the survival of the dynasty itself. These trusted attendants had learned to anticipate her needs and preferences, ensuring that she had everything necessary for productive work while never interrupting her thought processes. The contrast between her public ceremonial appearances and these private working sessions revealed the fundamental challenge that defined Cixi's entire career. During formal court functions, she was required to embody traditional feminine virtues of modesty, deference, and domestic focus. Yet the actual responsibilities of governing an empire demanded skills and knowledge that were traditionally considered masculine prerogatives, including military strategy, financial management, and diplomatic negotiation. This contradiction forced Cixi to develop extraordinary abilities in managing multiple identities and presentations of self according to the requirements of different situations and audiences. With foreign diplomats, she projected the dignity and authority of imperial power, while carefully avoiding any appearance of unwomanly aggression. With military commanders, she demonstrated strategic understanding while maintaining appropriate deference to their professional expertise. With court officials, she exercised decisive leadership while preserving the fiction that she was merely implementing her son's wishes. The psychological strain of maintaining these multiple personas while carrying the enormous burdens of imperial responsibility would have destroyed most individuals, but Cixi seemed to thrive on the intellectual challenges and political complexities that defined her daily existence. Her energy levels remained remarkably high despite the 18-hour workdays that had become her normal routine. Her mental acuity appeared to sharpen rather than diminish under the pressure of making decisions that could affect the welfare of hundreds of millions of people. The winter of 1866 brought particularly severe challenges that tested every aspect of Cixi's administrative capabilities and political judgment. A series of natural disasters, including floods in the south and droughts in the north, created refugee populations that required emergency relief efforts coordinated across vast distances. Foreign powers were demanding new concessions that would further erode Chinese sovereignty, while military campaigns against remaining rebel groups continued to drain the imperial treasury. Her response to these converging crises demonstrated the evolution of her governing philosophy from the reactive policies that had characterized the early years of her regency to the proactive strategies that would define her mature leadership style. Instead of simply responding to immediate emergencies, she began implementing systematic reforms designed to strengthen the empire's long-term ability to cope with future challenges. The administrative reforms she initiated during this period included modernization of the imperial examination system to include practical subjects like mathematics, geography, and foreign languages, alongside traditional literary and philosophical studies. She established new government departments responsible for managing foreign relations, military modernization, and infrastructure development according to contemporary international standards, rather than ancient Chinese precedents. Her approach to military reform reflected sophisticated understanding of the technological and organizational changes that were transforming warfare throughout the world. She authorized the purchase of modern weapons from European manufacturers, while also supporting efforts to develop domestic arms production capabilities that would reduce Chinese dependence on foreign suppliers. She recruited foreign military advisors to train Chinese officers in contemporary tactical principles, while ensuring that strategic command remained firmly under Chinese control. The economic policies implemented during this period revealed Cixi's recognition that China's traditional agricultural economy needed to be supplemented with modern industrial and commercial development if the empire was to compete effectively with foreign powers. She authorized the construction of telegraph lines that would improve communication between different regions while also facilitating commercial transactions. She supported railroad construction projects that would reduce transportation costs and enable more efficient distribution of goods throughout the empire. These modernization efforts required Cixi to navigate complex negotiations with foreign investors and contractors whose expertise was essential for implementing new technologies, but whose presence also raised sensitive questions about national sovereignty and cultural integrity. Her diplomatic skills were tested repeatedly as she sought to obtain necessary technical assistance, while avoiding the political concessions that foreign powers typically demanded in exchange for their cooperation. The success of these reform initiatives gradually transformed Cixi's political position from embattled regent defending her authority against traditional opponents to confident leader implementing a comprehensive vision for Chinese development and modernization. Provincial officials who had initially viewed her with suspicion began to appreciate the practical benefits of her policies for their own administrative effectiveness and career advancement. Military commanders who had questioned female leadership of military affairs were impressed by her understanding of strategic principles and her commitment to providing them with the resources necessary for professional success. Foreign diplomats who had expected to exploit Chinese weakness during a regency period discovered that they were dealing with a formidable negotiator whose knowledge of international law and commercial practices exceeded that of many of their own colleagues. The transformation of Cixi's public image during this period reflected not just her personal achievements, but also broader changes in Chinese society's understanding of political authority and gender roles. The desperate circumstances facing the empire had created conditions where traditional prejudices against female leadership were subordinated to practical concerns about governmental effectiveness and dynastic survival. Her daily routine during the late 1860s settled into patterns that would characterize her leadership style for the remainder of her long career. Each morning brought fresh challenges that required immediate attention, but she had developed systematic approaches to information gathering, consultation, and decision-making that enabled her to respond effectively to unexpected developments while maintaining focus on long-term strategic objectives. The confidence that Cixi displayed during this period of consolidation and reform reflected her growing understanding that she had successfully navigated the most dangerous phase of her political career. The opposition that had initially threatened to destroy her regency had been neutralized through a combination of skillful alliance building, effective policy implementation, and patient cultivation of key constituencies whose support was essential for maintaining power. Yet even as she celebrated these achievements, Cixi understood that her position remained fundamentally vulnerable to changes in circumstances that were beyond her direct control. The young emperor was approaching an age where his continued dependence on maternal guidance would appear increasingly inappropriate. Foreign powers were developing new technologies and strategies that could render Chinese defensive capabilities obsolete. Internal social and economic pressures were creating conditions that could explode into rebellion if not addressed through continued reform and modernization. The challenge that would define the next phase of her career was transforming the temporary authority of regency into more permanent forms of political influence that could survive transitions in formal governmental arrangements. This would require her to develop new justifications for female participation in imperial politics, while also ensuring that her policies had created sufficient benefits for key constituencies to guarantee their continued support, regardless of changes in official titles or ceremonial positions. The evening of December 31st, 1867, found Cixi reviewing the achievements and setbacks of a year that had fundamentally altered both her personal position and the trajectory of Chinese development. As she sat in her private study surrounded by maps, reports, and correspondence that documented the vast scope of her responsibilities, she could take satisfaction in having successfully met challenges that had defeated many of her predecessors. The empire that she now effectively ruled was still facing enormous difficulties, but it was no longer the helpless victim of foreign aggression and internal chaos that had seemed destined for collapse just a few years earlier. The reforms she had implemented were beginning to produce measurable improvements in administrative efficiency, military capability, and economic productivity that provided hope for continued progress in the years ahead. Yet Cixi also understood that her greatest challenges still lay in the future. As the forces of modernization and international competition continued to accelerate at rates that tested the adaptive capabilities of even the most flexible political systems. The woman who had transformed herself from powerless concubine to supreme authority through intelligence, determination, and political skill would need to draw upon all of these resources and more as she prepared for the even greater tests that awaited her in the decades ahead. The oil lamps in her study burned late into the night as she continued working on plans and policies that would shape not just her own destiny, but the future of Chinese civilization itself. Outside her windows, the vast expanse of the Forbidden City lay shrouded in winter darkness, its ancient courtyards and pavilions holding secrets that stretched back through centuries of imperial history. Yet within those traditional walls, a revolutionary transformation was taking place as China's most powerful ruler prepared to lead her empire into an uncertain but potentially magnificent future. As the 1870s dawned, Cixi found herself facing a crisis that would test every political instinct she had honed during her rise to power. The young Emperor Tongji had reached his majority, and traditionalist factions within the court were demanding that she step aside and allow him to assume direct control of the government. The whispers had grown louder in recent months, echoing through the marble corridors where officials gathered in small groups, their voices dropping to hushed tones whenever her trusted eunuchs passed by. Her morning ritual had taken on new urgency during these uncertain times. She would wake in the pre-dawn darkness, her chambers illuminated only by the soft glow of oil lamps that cast dancing shadows across silk tapestries depicting scenes of imperial triumph. The familiar weight of responsibility settled upon her shoulders as she prepared for another day of navigating the treacherous currents of palace politics while simultaneously governing an empire that demanded constant attention. The process of dressing had become a form of armor preparation. Each layer of silk, each carefully positioned ornament, each precisely arranged fold of fabric served not merely ceremonial purposes, but psychological ones. The phoenix crown that her servants placed upon her head transformed her from vulnerable woman into imperial authority incarnate. The jade bracelets that encircled her wrists carried the weight of dynastic tradition, while the golden dragon pins that secured her elaborate hairstyle proclaimed her right to command the loyalty of millions. Her private breakfast chamber had evolved into an intelligence center, where trusted informants delivered their nightly reports, while she consumed delicate rice porridge flavored with lotus seeds and ginseng. The conversations that accompanied these morning meals were conducted in the coded language that palace inhabitants had perfected over centuries. A comment about the weather might actually convey information about troop movements along the northern frontier. An observation about garden maintenance could signal the discovery of corruption within the provincial administration. The maps that covered her breakfast table told stories of an empire under constant pressure from multiple directions. Red pins marked locations where foreign merchants were demanding new trading privileges that would further erode Chinese sovereignty. Blue markers indicated regions where natural disasters had created refugee populations requiring emergency assistance. Black flags showed areas where bandit activity threatened the commercial networks that sustained imperial revenues. Each coloured symbol represented decisions that would need to be made before sunset, problems that required solutions combining diplomatic finesse, military strategy, and economic calculation. The sheer volume of information flowing through her chambers each morning would have overwhelmed most government officials, yet Cixi processed these reports with the efficiency of someone who had learned to compartmentalize complex challenges while maintaining focus on overarching strategic objectives. Her morning audiences had become elaborate theatrical productions designed to project imperial authority while managing the delicate transition from regency to direct imperial rule. The hall of mental cultivation filled each day with officials who performed the ancient rituals of imperial consultation while actually engaging in sophisticated political negotiations about the future direction of Chinese governance. Emperor Cixi would sit upon the dragon throne, wearing robes that had been worn by his ancestors for generations, but his responses to ministerial petitions were carefully scripted based on policy decisions that Cixi had made during her pre-dawn planning sessions. The yellow silk screen that supposedly separated maternal advice from imperial command had become increasingly transparent as courtiers recognized that real authority continued to flow from the palace of compassion and tranquility. The young emperor's performance during these daily ceremonies revealed both his intelligence and his limitations. At 19, he possessed the quick wit and natural dignity that were essential for effective imperial leadership, but he lacked the deep knowledge of governmental operations and international relations that had taken Cixi decades to acquire. His questions about military logistics often betrayed gaps in understanding that could prove dangerous during crisis situations. His responses to diplomatic communications sometimes reflected idealistic assumptions about foreign intentions that more experienced observers found naive. These limitations created opportunities for Cixi to demonstrate her continued indispensability while gradually preparing her son for eventual assumption of full imperial responsibilities. Her interventions during morning audiences were presented as helpful suggestions from a devoted mother, but they actually constituted detailed instructions about policy implementation that reflected her superior understanding of administrative complexities and international pressures. The afternoon hours brought private tutorials where Cixi attempted to transfer decades of accumulated knowledge about statecraft and political survival to an intelligent but inexperienced young man who had grown up surrounded by luxury and deference. These educational sessions took place in secluded pavilions, where the artificial constraints of formal protocol could be temporarily suspended in favor of honest discussion about the realities of governing an empire in crisis. The curriculum for these private lessons covered subjects that were never addressed in traditional imperial education programs. Cixi taught her son to recognize the subtle signs of corruption that could undermine governmental effectiveness. She explained the economic relationships between different regions that made certain policy combinations politically impossible. She described the psychological motivations that drove foreign diplomats to make specific demands during international negotiations. Most importantly, she shared insights about human nature and political loyalty that could only be gained through years of direct experience with the betrayals and alliances that characterized court life. The young emperor learned to identify which officials could be trusted with sensitive information and which required constant supervision. He discovered how to balance competing interests within the imperial bureaucracy while maintaining the appearance of impartial justice that was essential for dynastic legitimacy. The garden walks that followed these tutorial sessions provided opportunities for mother and son to discuss sensitive political matters in settings where surveillance was more difficult and conversations could flow more naturally. The carefully designed landscapes that surrounded the Palace of Compassion and Tranquility created an illusion of privacy that encouraged honest communication about subjects that might be too dangerous to address in formal settings. During these walks among flowering trees and ornamental ponds, Cixi would test her son's understanding of lessons from earlier sessions while also sharing personal observations about specific officials whose loyalty or competence might become crucial during future crises. The young emperor learned to evaluate competing policy recommendations based on their practical implications rather than their theoretical appeal. He discovered how to maintain authority over subordinates while also gathering accurate information about conditions throughout the empire. These informal educational sessions revealed the complexity of preparing someone for supreme political responsibility within a system that provided no formal training for imperial leadership. Traditional Chinese education emphasized literary accomplishment and philosophical understanding, but governing an empire required practical skills in military strategy, economic management, and diplomatic negotiation that were normally acquired through years of administrative experience. Cixi's approach to this educational challenge reflected her recognition that the dynasty's survival might depend on her son's ability to maintain the modernization programs she had initiated, while also preserving the traditional sources of imperial legitimacy that sustained popular loyalty. The balance between innovation and continuity required political judgment that could only be developed through careful mentorship combined with gradual assumption of real responsibility. The evening hours brought the most challenging aspect of Cixi's daily routine, as she attempted to manage the growing pressure for her to withdraw from active political involvement while simultaneously ensuring that essential governmental functions continued to operate effectively. The formal dinner parties that she hosted for senior officials had become complex diplomatic events where competing factions presented their arguments about the proper timing and methods for transitioning to direct imperial rule. These dinner conversations required Cixi to demonstrate multiple forms of expertise simultaneously. She needed to display maternal devotion that would justify her continued involvement in her son's political education. She had to show administrative competence that would prove her policies were producing beneficial results for the empire. She was required to project personal humility that would deflect accusations of inappropriate ambition while actually defending her right to maintain political influence. The dining room in her private apartments had been carefully arranged to facilitate these complex negotiations. Round tables encouraged informal conversation, while also ensuring that no guest could claim preferential seating arrangements. The menu featured delicacies from throughout the empire, subtle reminders of the diversity that made unified governance both necessary and challenging. The serving arrangements allowed Cixi to demonstrate gracious hospitality while also controlling the flow of conversation through strategic timing of course presentations. The guests invited to these dinners represented a careful cross-section of imperial officialdom designed to maintain factional balance while also gathering intelligence about potential opposition to her continued leadership. Military commanders shared tables with civilian administrators whose cooperation was essential for implementing defense policies. Provincial governors socialized with court officials whose support was necessary for maintaining central authority. Foreign diplomatic representatives mingled with Chinese scholars whose expertise was valuable for international negotiations. The conversations that emerged during these carefully orchestrated social events revealed the full complexity of the political challenges facing the imperial system during this period of transition. Traditional officials argued for restoration of conventional governmental arrangements that would eliminate female participation in political decision-making. Modernist factions supported continued reform programs that required experienced leadership regardless of gender considerations. Regional representatives advocated for policies that would address local concerns while also strengthening overall imperial unity. Cixi's responses to these competing arguments demonstrated the political skills that had enabled her to maintain power during more than a decade of unprecedented challenges. She acknowledged legitimate concerns about constitutional propriety, while also highlighting practical benefits that her policies had produced for different constituencies. She expressed appropriate deference to traditional values, while also defending innovative approaches that had strengthened imperial capabilities. The late evening hours provided opportunities for private consultations with key officials whose support would be crucial for managing the transition to direct imperial rule according to arrangements that preserved her ability to influence policy decisions. These confidential meetings took place in intimate settings where participants could speak honestly about sensitive subjects without concern for ceremonial protocols or potential surveillance by hostile observers. The palace chambers where these evening conferences occurred were furnished with comfortable seating arrangements that encouraged extended discussion while also maintaining appropriate hierarchical relationships between imperial authority and ministerial subordination. Soft lighting from carefully positioned oil lamps created an atmosphere of confidential consultation, while the sound of water from nearby garden fountains provided acoustic cover for conversations that might prove dangerous if overheard by unauthorized individuals. During these private meetings, Cixi explored various scenarios for maintaining her political influence after the formal end of her regency period. Constitutional arrangements that had worked effectively in other monarchical systems provided potential models for Chinese adaptation. Historical precedents from earlier dynastic periods offered examples of successful power-sharing agreements between emperors and influential relatives. Contemporary international practices suggested diplomatic protocols that might accommodate unusual governmental arrangements. The officials who participated in these confidential planning sessions represented diverse perspectives on the optimal balance between traditional legitimacy and practical effectiveness in imperial governance. Some advocated for formal constitutional changes that would create permanent advisory roles for experienced leaders, regardless of their family relationships to reigning emperors. Others preferred informal arrangements that would maintain traditional appearances while ensuring continued access to proven administrative expertise. These discussions revealed the fundamental tension between theoretical principles of imperial authority and practical requirements of effective governance that had characterized Chinese political philosophy for centuries. The mandate of heaven that legitimized dynastic rule was traditionally understood to flow through male lineage, but the actual responsibilities of imperial administration required capabilities that were not necessarily related to gender or family relationships. Cixi's position in these debates was complicated by her need to defend both her personal right to continued political participation and the broader principle that governmental effectiveness should take precedence over conventional restrictions based on gender or traditional protocol. Her arguments combined appeals to practical necessity with sophisticated interpretations of classical political texts that supported flexible approaches to imperial organization. The midnight hours found Cixi alone in her private study, reviewing the day's developments while preparing for the challenges that would emerge with tomorrow's dawn. The oil lamps that illuminated her late-night work sessions cast dancing shadows across documents that recorded the pulse of an empire struggling to maintain stability while adapting to revolutionary changes in technology, economics, and international relations. Her personal correspondence during this period reflected the complexity of maintaining relationships with officials throughout the empire, whose loyalty and competence were essential for implementing policies that required coordination across vast distances and diverse populations. The letters she composed each evening were carefully crafted to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously, while also providing specific guidance about administrative matters that required immediate attention. The provincial governors who received her detailed instructions about flood relief efforts also found personal inquiries about their family welfare and career aspirations that reinforced bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation. Military commanders who were given strategic directives about frontier defense also received recognition for their professional achievements and promises of continued imperial support for their operational requirements. Diplomatic officials, who were provided with negotiating instructions, also discovered expressions of confidence in their abilities and acknowledgement of the difficult circumstances under which they were required to operate. These extensive correspondence networks required Cixi to maintain detailed knowledge about hundreds of individual officials whose personal characteristics, political loyalties, and administrative capabilities affected the implementation of imperial policies throughout the empire. Her private files contained biographical information about key personnel that included family relationships, educational backgrounds, career accomplishments, and potential vulnerabilities that might influence their behavior during crisis situations. The maps and charts that covered her study walls during these late-night strategy sessions provided visual representations of challenges that required constant attention from imperial leadership. Economic data tracked revenue flows from different regions while also identifying areas where tax collection was being undermined by local corruption or administrative incompetence. Military intelligence plotted the movements of potential threats, while also monitoring the readiness of Chinese forces that might be required for defensive or offensive operations. Demographic information revealed population movements that could affect political stability, while also suggesting economic opportunities that might be developed through appropriate infrastructure investments. Commercial statistics documented trade patterns that connected Chinese markets with international networks, while also highlighting vulnerabilities to foreign economic manipulation that required defensive countermeasures. The integration of this vast array of information into coherent policy strategies required analytical capabilities that Cixi had developed through decades of practical experience with the complexities of imperial administration. Her ability to identify connections between seemingly unrelated developments enabled her to anticipate problems before they became serious threats, while also recognizing opportunities that might be exploited for imperial advantage. The winter of 1872 brought a crisis that would test all of Cixi's political skills, as rumors began circulating about Emperor Tongji's desire to assert complete independence from maternal guidance. Foreign diplomats reported conversations with young courtiers who claimed that the emperor was planning dramatic policy changes that would signal his emergence as an autonomous leader. Provincial officials sent coded messages expressing uncertainty about whether existing administrative arrangements would continue under direct imperial rule. These developments created immediate dangers for Cixi's continued political survival, while also threatening the stability of governmental operations that depended on experienced leadership during a period of ongoing international pressure and internal challenges. Her response to this emerging crisis would demonstrate whether the skills that had enabled her to achieve supreme power could also be adapted to maintain influence under changed constitutional circumstances. The strategies she developed during the long winter nights of 1872 would determine not only her personal fate, but also the future direction of Chinese development during a crucial period when decisions made in Beijing would affect the trajectory of world history. The woman who had transformed herself from powerless concubine to supreme authority was about to face her most challenging test as she sought to preserve both her political influence and the reform programs that represented her most significant contribution to Chinese civilization. The crisis that would define the remainder of Cixi's reign began with a single conversation overheard in the gardens of the Summer Palace. A young eunuch, carrying tea to the emperor's private chambers, paused behind a decorative screen when he heard voices discussing plans that would shake the foundations of her carefully constructed authority. The words he reported to Cixi's trusted network spoke of secret meetings, foreign advisors, and a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Emperor Tongji had indeed begun asserting his independence, but not in ways that anyone had anticipated. His daily routine had subtly shifted over the previous months, with private audiences that excluded his mother's representatives and evening consultations with officials who had never been part of Cixi's inner circle. The young emperor would wake each morning in his chambers within the Palace of Heavenly Purity, dismissing the traditional attendants who had served as Cixi's informal observers, while surrounding himself with younger courtiers whose loyalties remained unclear. His breakfast conversations no longer focused on administrative reports and policy discussions that had characterized the Regency period. Instead, the emperor entertained visiting scholars who spoke passionately about political theories imported from Europe and America. These foreign-educated intellectuals brought books written in languages that few court officials could read, describing governmental systems that challenged every assumption about imperial authority that had sustained Chinese civilization for millennia. The morning walks that had once provided opportunities for Cixi to continue her son's political education were now solitary affairs, where Emperor Tongji strode through the Forbidden City's courtyards, accompanied only by guards whose silence was enforced by imperial command. The young emperor would pause at pavilions where previous rulers had composed poetry or contemplated philosophical texts, but his thoughts seemed focused on problems that extended far beyond traditional concerns about dynastic legitimacy and administrative efficiency. Palace servants reported observing the emperor studying maps that showed not just Chinese territories, but global trade routes, international telegraph networks, and foreign military installations that suggested interests extending far beyond conventional imperial responsibilities. His personal library had expanded to include technical manuals about railroad construction, industrial manufacturing, and financial systems that operated according to principles unknown to traditional Chinese economic theory. The afternoon audiences that had once served as collaborative policy sessions between mother and son were transformed into formal ceremonies where Emperor Tongji received ministerial reports with polite attention, but without the detailed questioning that had characterized previous consultations. The young emperor's responses to administrative recommendations became increasingly brief and non-committal, as if he were postponing important decisions until he could implement alternative procedures for governmental consultation. Cixi observed these developments with growing alarm while maintaining the careful facade of maternal pride in her son's increasing maturity and independence. Her own daily routine required constant adaptation to gather intelligence about the emperor's activities, while avoiding any appearance of inappropriate surveillance or interference with his legitimate authority. The morning reports from her network of informants painted an increasingly troubling picture of imperial isolation from established advisory systems. The breakfast meetings in her private chambers took on new urgency, as trusted officials shared fragments of information about the emperor's private consultations with individuals whose identities and qualifications remain mysterious. Foreign diplomatic personnel were requesting audiences with increasing frequency, suggesting international interest in potential policy changes that might accompany the transition to direct imperial rule. Provincial governors were submitting reports that posed careful questions about the continuity of existing administrative arrangements. Her afternoon conferences with senior ministers became exercises in diplomatic communication, where participants discussed sensitive subjects through layers of ceremonial language designed to avoid direct criticism of imperial behavior while expressing legitimate concerns about governmental stability. These conversations revealed growing anxiety among experienced officials who recognized that effective administration required institutional continuity that transcended individual leadership transitions. The evening hours brought private consultations with military commanders whose loyalty to the dynasty remained absolute, but whose understanding of strategic requirements made them increasingly concerned about potential disruption of defense policies that had taken years to develop and implement. These officers reported subtle changes in imperial communications about frontier security that suggested possible shifts in strategic priorities that could affect the empire's ability to respond to external threats. The garden walks that had once provided peaceful interludes for reflection and informal consultation now became reconnaissance missions where Cixi observed the changing patterns of palace life, while carefully avoiding any appearance of inappropriate curiosity about her son's private activities. The ornamental landscapes that surrounded her residence offered vantage points for monitoring the flow of visitors to the Emperor's chambers, while the sound of water from decorative fountains provided acoustic cover for conversations with loyal servants who served as her eyes and ears throughout the imperial complex. Her correspondence with provincial officials required increasingly sophisticated diplomatic language as she sought to maintain administrative continuity while respecting constitutional proprieties about the scope of imperial authority. The letters she composed each evening were masterpieces of political communication that provided necessary guidance about policy implementation, while avoiding any suggestion of interference with legitimate imperial prerogatives. The intelligence networks that Cixi had cultivated over decades of palace politics now became essential resources for understanding developments that could affect not only her personal position, but also the stability of governmental operations throughout the empire. The coded messages that arrived each night revealed a complex pattern of foreign influence and domestic intrigue that suggested coordination between external powers and internal factions, seeking to exploit the transition period for their own strategic advantage. European diplomatic representatives were reportedly offering technical assistance and financial support for modernization programs that would require fundamental changes in traditional governmental structures. American commercial interests were proposing industrial development projects that would integrate Chinese economic systems with international networks controlled by foreign corporations. Japanese military advisors were suggesting defense reforms that would align Chinese strategic planning with regional security arrangements dominated by foreign powers. These foreign initiatives were being promoted through Chinese intermediaries whose backgrounds revealed concerning patterns of education abroad, financial dependence on foreign sponsors, and ideological commitments to political systems that contradicted basic principles of imperial governance. The young scholars who had gained influence with Emperor Tongji possessed impressive credentials from European universities, but their loyalty to Chinese interests remained questionable given their obvious enthusiasm for foreign models of political organization. The winter of 1873 brought developments that transformed Cixi's concerns from political anxiety into existential alarm about the survival of the dynasty itself. Reports from her intelligence networks described secret meetings where participants discussed not just policy reforms, but fundamental changes in the nature of imperial authority that would effectively end thousands of years of dynastic tradition in favor of governmental systems borrowed from foreign powers. The meetings allegedly took place in private residences throughout Beijing, where young officials gathered to discuss translations of foreign political texts that described republican governments, constitutional monarchies, and democratic institutions that eliminated hereditary authority in favor of elected leadership. These discussions were reportedly encouraged by foreign advisors who provided both intellectual guidance and financial support for Chinese participants willing to advocate for revolutionary changes in governmental structure. Emperor Tongji's participation in these discussions remained unclear, but his increasing isolation from traditional advisory systems created conditions where foreign influence could operate without effective oversight from experienced Chinese officials whose loyalty to dynastic institutions remained uncompromised. The young emperor's fascination with foreign ideas about governmental modernization made him vulnerable to manipulation by individuals whose ultimate objectives might extend far beyond simple administrative reform. The spring of 1874 brought a personal crisis that would overshadow all political considerations as Emperor Tongji's health began to deteriorate rapidly under circumstances that suggested more than simple illness. The young emperor's morning routine became increasingly erratic as periods of apparent normalcy alternated with episodes of confusion and physical weakness that palace physicians seemed unable to explain or treat effectively. His daily audiences with government ministers were frequently cancelled without explanation, creating administrative paralysis that affected policy implementation throughout the empire. Foreign diplomats reported conversations with court officials who expressed growing concern about the emperor's ability to fulfill his governmental responsibilities during a period when decisive leadership was essential for addressing mounting international pressures. The medical consultations that occupied increasing portions of each day revealed symptoms that defied conventional diagnosis while creating opportunities for various factions to promote their own theories about appropriate treatment approaches. Traditional Chinese physicians recommended herbal remedies and acupuncture treatments that reflected thousands of years of accumulated medical knowledge. Foreign doctors suggested modern medicines and therapeutic procedures that had proven effective in European hospitals, but remained largely untested in Chinese patients. Cixi found herself navigating between competing medical recommendations, while also managing the political implications of her son's illness for the stability of imperial government. Her daily routine expanded to include consultations with physicians whose professional disagreements reflected broader cultural conflicts between traditional Chinese approaches to health and foreign medical practices that emphasized scientific methodology over accumulated wisdom. The afternoon vigils at the emperor's bedside provided opportunities for Cixi to observe his condition, while also monitoring the various officials and advisors who sought access to imperial authority during periods of reduced consciousness and compromised judgment. These bedside scenes revealed the vulnerability of dynastic institutions to exploitation during periods when normal protective mechanisms were weakened by medical crises. The evening conferences with senior ministers took on new urgency as participants discussed contingency plans for governmental continuity during extended imperial incapacitation. These discussions required careful balance between preparing for potential succession scenarios while avoiding any appearance of premature assumption that the emperor's condition was beyond recovery. The late-night strategy sessions in Cixi's private study now focused on multiple crisis scenarios simultaneously as she prepared for possibilities ranging from gradual imperial recovery to sudden dynastic succession that would require immediate implementation of regency arrangements. The maps and documents that covered her work surfaces during these planning sessions reflected the complexity of governing an empire where political stability depended on individual leadership during a period when that leadership had become unreliable. Her correspondence with provincial officials required increasingly careful diplomatic language as she sought to maintain administrative continuity while avoiding any suggestion of unauthorized assumption of imperial prerogatives. The governors and military commanders, who depended on clear central guidance for policy implementation, needed reassurance about governmental stability without receiving information that might undermine confidence in legitimate imperial authority. The intelligence reports that arrived each midnight revealed growing international attention to the Chinese succession crisis as foreign powers positioned themselves to exploit potential instability for their own strategic advantage. European diplomatic missions were reportedly developing contingency plans for different succession scenarios that might create opportunities for extracting additional concessions from a weakened Chinese government. The complexity of managing these converging crises while maintaining constitutional propriety and dynastic legitimacy tested every political skill that Cixi had developed during her extraordinary rise to power. The decisions she made during the emperor's illness would determine not only the immediate survival of her political influence, but also the long-term trajectory of Chinese development during a crucial period when the empire's ability to adapt to international pressures would determine its survival as an independent civilization. As autumn approached in 1874, the emperor's condition continued to deteriorate, despite the best efforts of both traditional and modern medical practitioners. The young ruler, who had shown such promise for independent leadership, now spent most days confined to his chambers, tended by physicians who privately acknowledged their inability to understand or treat his mysterious ailments. The imperial court that had functioned effectively for over a decade under Cixi's guidance now faced the prospect of another regency period, but under circumstances far more dangerous than those that had characterized her initial rise to power. Foreign pressures had intensified, internal challenges had multiplied, and the political factions that had accepted her authority during the previous crisis now included individuals whose loyalty to traditional dynastic institutions remained questionable. The woman who had transformed herself from powerless concubine to supreme authority through intelligence, determination, and political skill now faced the ultimate test of whether those same qualities could preserve both her personal position and the imperial system itself during a period when the very foundations of Chinese civilization were under assault from forces that had learned to exploit internal weakness for their own strategic objectives. The oil lamps that illuminated her late-night planning sessions cast dancing shadows across documents that recorded not just the immediate challenges facing her personal survival, but the broader question of whether traditional Chinese governmental institutions could adapt successfully to the revolutionary changes that were transforming the entire world during the final decades of the 19th century. The dawn of January 12, 1875, brought news that would forever alter the course of Chinese history. Emperor Tongzhi had died during the night, his 20-year reign ending as palace physicians stood helplessly by his bedside, their remedies exhausted and their understanding defeated by an illness that had consumed the young ruler's strength over months of gradual decline. The silence that filled the emperor's chambers seemed to expand outward through the corridors of the Forbidden City, touching every corner of an empire that now faced the terrifying prospect of succession without clear constitutional guidance. Cixi sat motionless beside her son's bed, her fingers still wrapped around his lifeless hand, while the reality of her transformed circumstances settled upon her like winter frost. The young man who had represented both her greatest achievement and her most dangerous challenge was gone, leaving behind a political vacuum that would either destroy everything she had built or provide the opportunity to secure her legacy in ways that no previous crisis had allowed. The imperial physicians who had attended the emperor's final hours moved through the chamber with the silent efficiency of men who understood that their failure to preserve imperial life might cost them their own. They gathered their instruments and medicine bottles while avoiding eye contact with the woman whose grief would soon transform into the calculated determination that had sustained her through every previous challenge to her authority and survival. The eunuchs who served as Cixi's most trusted informants waited in the antechamber beyond the death scene, their faces carefully composed to conceal thoughts about the political opportunities that imperial mortality had suddenly created. These men had witnessed the rise and fall of emperors throughout their decades of palace service, and they understood that the next few hours would determine whether their current patron could navigate the constitutional crisis that now threatened to engulf the dynasty itself. The morning light that filtered through the paper windows illuminated a chamber where death had created possibilities that life had made impossible. Without a direct heir, the succession would require decisions about dynastic continuity that could either strengthen traditional imperial institutions or provide opportunities for the revolutionary changes that foreign advisors had been promoting among younger court officials throughout the previous year. Cixi's first decision revealed the political instincts that had enabled her to survive and prosper during more than a decade of unprecedented challenges. Rather than allowing news of the emperor's death to spread through unofficial channels where rumors and speculation might create panic, She immediately implemented information control procedures that would enable her to manage both the timing and content of public announcements about the succession crisis. Her morning routine on this day of imperial death began not with the usual intelligence briefings and policy consultations, but with urgent conferences where trusted officials received instructions about securing key government installations while preventing unauthorized access to imperial authority during the vulnerable transition period. The breakfast that was served in her private chambers went untouched as she dictated messages to provincial governors whose loyalty would be essential for maintaining stability throughout the empire. The maps that covered her work table during these emergency planning sessions now displayed not just the usual indicators of foreign threats and domestic challenges, but new markers representing potential opposition to her continued authority from court factions that might exploit the succession crisis to advance their own political objectives. The red pins that marked foreign military positions suddenly seemed more threatening, while the blue flags indicating regional unrest took on new significance as potential rallying points for rebellion against central authority. Her afternoon conferences with senior ministers revealed the full complexity of the constitutional challenge that imperial death had created. Traditional succession laws required the selection of a new emperor from among eligible male relatives of the deceased ruler, but Emperor Tongji's childless death meant that such selection would require negotiations among court factions whose competing interests might prove impossible to reconcile through conventional political processes. The candidates whose names emerged during these discussions represented different approaches to the fundamental questions about imperial authority that had been developing throughout the previous year. Some potential emperors were associated with conservative factions that favored restoration of traditional governmental arrangements and resistance to foreign influence. Others had connections to modernist groups that supported continued reform programs and accommodation with international pressures for political change. Cixi listened to these discussions with the calculating mind that had served her so well during previous crises, recognizing that the selection process would provide opportunities to influence not just the identity of the next emperor, but also the governmental arrangements that would define imperial authority during the crucial years ahead. Her responses to ministerial recommendations revealed sophisticated understanding of how succession negotiations could be managed to preserve her political influence while also ensuring dynastic stability. The evening hours brought private consultations with military commanders whose support would be essential for implementing whatever succession arrangements emerged from court negotiations. These officers represented the ultimate guarantee of imperial authority, and their loyalty to specific candidates or constitutional arrangements could determine whether political transitions occurred peacefully or required military intervention to maintain order and legitimacy. The garden walks that had once provided peaceful interludes for reflection now became strategic reconnaissance, as Cixi observed the movements of officials whose activities might reveal factional alignments that could affect succession negotiations. The ornamental landscapes that surrounded her residence offered vantage points for monitoring unusual gatherings, while the sound of water from decorative fountains provided acoustic cover for conversations with intelligence agents who reported on developing political coalitions. Her correspondence during this period required unprecedented diplomatic finesse, as she communicated with officials throughout the empire whose continued loyalty was essential for preventing the succession crisis from triggering broader governmental collapse. The letters she composed each evening were carefully crafted to project confidence in dynastic continuity while avoiding any premature commitments about specific succession arrangements that might prove politically impossible to implement. The late-night strategy sessions in her private study now focused on multiple scenarios for managing the selection process according to arrangements that would preserve her ability to influence imperial policy regardless of which candidate ultimately emerged as emperor. The documents that covered her work surfaces included genealogical charts that mapped relationships between potential successors and detailed assessments of their political affiliations, personal characteristics, and vulnerability to external manipulation. The oil lamps that illuminated these midnight planning sessions cast shadows across materials that revealed the full scope of foreign interest in Chinese succession arrangements. Intelligence reports described European diplomatic missions developing position papers about preferred candidates who might prove more amenable to international demands for additional territorial and commercial concessions. American commercial representatives were reportedly offering financial support for modernist factions that favored economic policies aligned with foreign business interests. The complexity of managing these domestic and international pressures while maintaining constitutional legitimacy required Cixi to employ every political skill she had developed throughout her extraordinary career. The strategies she devised during these crucial weeks would determine whether the succession crisis strengthened or weakened her position, whether traditional imperial institutions survived the transition, and whether China could maintain sufficient unity to resist foreign pressures that threatened national independence. Her solution to the succession challenge demonstrated the creative intelligence that had enabled her to transform impossible situations into opportunities for enhanced authority. Rather than supporting any of the adult candidates whose selection would require her to accept subordinate status, Cixi promoted the candidacy of her 3-year-old nephew, Zhaitian, whose youth would necessitate another regency period during which she could maintain effective control of governmental operations. The morning of February 25, 1875, brought the formal announcement that would reshape Chinese politics for the next 3 decades. In the Hall of Supreme Harmony, before assembled court officials and foreign diplomatic observers, the child who would become Emperor Guangxu was proclaimed as legitimate successor to the Dragon Throne. The ceremony followed ancient protocols that invested the proceedings with traditional legitimacy, while actually implementing revolutionary changes in the practical distribution of imperial authority. Cixi's position as regent for the new child emperor provided constitutional justification for her continued participation in governmental decision-making, while also creating opportunities to implement reform programs that had been interrupted by the political uncertainties of the previous year. The regency arrangements that were announced during the succession ceremony included provisions for administrative continuity that preserved existing policy initiatives while providing flexibility for future adaptations to changing circumstances. The foreign diplomatic representatives who witnessed these succession ceremonies recognized immediately that Chinese governmental operations would continue under the effective leadership of the woman who had demonstrated exceptional competence during more than a decade of crisis management. Their reports to home governments described regency arrangements that promised both stability and continued accessibility for international negotiations about commercial and territorial issues that required ongoing attention. The provincial governors who received official notifications about the new imperial succession expressed relief that administrative continuity would be maintained during a period when effective central guidance was essential for managing local challenges ranging from natural disasters to foreign commercial pressures. Their responses to succession announcements revealed appreciation for leadership arrangements that preserved institutional knowledge while providing clear chains of command for policy implementation. The military commanders who pledged loyalty to the new emperor understood that their oath actually represented commitment to governmental arrangements that had proven effective for maintaining imperial security and territorial integrity during unprecedented external pressures. Their support for regency arrangements reflected professional assessment that experienced leadership was essential for addressing strategic challenges that required sophisticated understanding of international military developments. The transformation of Cixi's constitutional status from Dowager Empress to regent provided legal foundations for authority that extended far beyond the informal influence she had wielded during her son's reign. The regency arrangements that were established during the succession crisis created institutional frameworks that would enable her to implement comprehensive reform programs while maintaining the traditional appearances that were essential for dynastic legitimacy. Her daily routine as regent for Emperor Guangxu settled into patterns that would characterize her leadership style during what would prove to be the most productive and transformative period of her extraordinary political career. Each morning brought fresh opportunities to advance modernization initiatives that had been constrained by constitutional uncertainties during the previous imperial transition. Each afternoon provided occasions to demonstrate administrative competence that justified continued regency authority. Each evening offered possibilities for building coalitions that would support reform programs designed to strengthen Chinese capabilities for resisting foreign domination. The palace chambers that had witnessed her rise from powerless concubine to supreme authority now became command centers for implementing policies that would determine whether traditional Chinese civilization could adapt successfully to the revolutionary challenges of the modern world. The maps and documents that covered her work surfaces during these planning sessions recorded not just immediate administrative requirements, but long-term strategic objectives that extended decades into an uncertain but potentially magnificent future. The woman who had achieved the impossible through intelligence, determination, and political skill now possessed both the authority and the opportunity to transform her personal triumph into lasting benefits for the Chinese people and the imperial system that had provided the framework for her remarkable achievements. The teenage concubine who had entered the Forbidden City with nothing but ambition and intelligence had become the most powerful ruler in the world's most populous empire, proving that exceptional individuals could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles through careful planning, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to their ultimate objectives. As spring returned to Beijing in 1875, the gardens of the Forbidden City bloomed with flowers that had witnessed centuries of imperial transitions, but none more extraordinary than the consolidation of authority by a woman whose journey from humble origins to supreme power represented one of history's most remarkable examples of personal transformation and political achievement. The oil lamps in her study would burn late into countless future nights as she continued working on plans and policies that would shape not just her own legacy, but the destiny of Chinese civilization during its most challenging and crucial period of adaptation to an increasingly interconnected and competitive world. The cherry blossoms that adorned the imperial gardens in the spring of 1875 seemed to mock the gravity of decisions being made within the vermilion walls of the Forbidden City. As Cixi settled into her role as regent for the child Emperor Guangxu, she understood that this new phase would require even greater subtlety than her previous maneuvers. The 3-year-old emperor would sit upon the dragon throne during morning audiences, his tiny hands gripping the armrests, while Cixi's voice emerged from behind the familiar yellow silk screen with commands that would reshape an empire. Her morning routine had evolved into a symphony of controlled chaos. She would rise at 4 in the morning, her chambers already bustling with eunuchs carrying dispatches that had arrived during the night from across the vast empire. The silver tea service that awaited her held not just delicate jasmine tea, but also coded messages hidden beneath porcelain saucers. A merchant's complaint about trade disruptions might actually contain intelligence about Russian troop movements along the northern frontier. A provincial report about agricultural yields could signal the discovery of corruption within local tax collection systems. The process of dressing had become even more elaborate, if such a thing were possible. Each morning, her attendants would select from robes that told specific stories to different audiences. The deep purple silk embroidered with golden phoenixes communicated maternal authority over the child emperor. The midnight blue fabric decorated with silver dragons announced her regency powers to court officials. The ceremonial yellow reserved for imperial occasions proclaimed her status as the effective ruler of China, regardless of constitutional technicalities. Her breakfast chamber had been transformed into what foreign observers would later describe as the nerve center of the Chinese government. Low tables arranged throughout the room held different categories of documents requiring immediate attention. Military dispatches occupied the eastern corner, their red wax seals broken and contents analyzed by dawn. Economic reports covered the western tables, their columns of figures revealing patterns of revenue and expenditure that determined the empire's capacity for both domestic programs and international obligations. Diplomatic correspondence filled the southern section, each foreign communication requiring careful analysis of both explicit demands and implicit threats. The young Emperor Guangxu would join her for these morning briefings, though his understanding remained limited to the simple explanations she provided about the colourful maps and interesting pictures that surrounded their shared meals. She would point to various regions on the Great Map that dominated the North Wall, describing them as places where loyal officials worked to keep the people happy and safe. The child would nod solemnly, already learning the weight of responsibility that would one day become his alone to bear. The morning audiences that followed breakfast had become masterpieces of political theatre designed to project imperial authority while managing the complex transition to renewed regency government. The hall of mental cultivation would fill each day with officials who performed elaborate ceremonies of consultation while actually participating in sophisticated negotiations about policy implementation and resource allocation. The child emperor would sit motionless upon his throne, his silence interpreted as imperial wisdom, while Cixi's carefully modulated voice provided detailed instructions about everything from military strategy to economic reform. Her afternoon schedule was devoted to private consultations that addressed the most sensitive aspects of governing an empire under constant pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. Foreign ambassadors would arrive bearing gifts and diplomatic notes that combined expressions of friendship with barely concealed threats about consequences for policies that displeased their home governments. Provincial governors would present detailed reports about local conditions that revealed patterns of success and failure in implementing central directives across regions with vastly different geographical, economic, and cultural characteristics. The garden pavilions where these afternoon meetings occurred had been carefully selected and arranged to create psychological advantages for Chinese negotiating positions. Foreign diplomats found themselves seated in positions where afternoon sunlight would shine directly into their eyes, while Cixi remained comfortably shaded behind ornate screens that allowed her to observe facial expressions and body language without revealing her own reactions to proposals or demands that required careful consideration before response. During these diplomatic encounters, she demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt her communication style to the cultural expectations and personal characteristics of each foreign representative. With British officials, she employed the formal courtesy that Victorian sensibilities demanded, while carefully avoiding any suggestion of subservience that might be interpreted as weakness. With French diplomats, she engaged in the sophisticated verbal dancing that Gallic culture appreciated, while ensuring that Chinese interests remained paramount in any agreements that emerged from these conversations. The most challenging negotiations involved German representatives whose systematic approach to international relations reflected their nation's growing military and industrial power. These officials arrived with detailed proposals for commercial agreements and territorial arrangements that would integrate Chinese economic systems with European networks in ways that promised both benefits and dangers for Chinese independence. Her responses required sophisticated understanding of international law and commercial practices that she had acquired through years of intensive study and practical experience. The American commissioners, who increasingly appeared at her afternoon receptions, represented a different type of challenge, as their democratic ideals and commercial ambitions created unique pressures for political reforms that would fundamentally alter traditional Chinese governmental structures. Their conversations often focused on educational exchanges and technological transfers that could modernize Chinese capabilities, while also creating dependencies on American expertise and equipment. Her evening routine during this period included extensive correspondence with Chinese officials studying abroad, who provided invaluable intelligence about foreign capabilities and intentions, while also representing potential channels for acquiring technological knowledge that could strengthen imperial defenses. These young scholars, primarily in European and American universities, sent detailed reports about industrial developments, military innovations, and political movements that could affect international relations with China. The letters she composed to these overseas students were carefully crafted to maintain their loyalty to Chinese interests, while encouraging them to acquire practical skills and theoretical knowledge that could be applied to domestic modernization programs. She inquired about their academic progress, while also requesting specific information about foreign manufacturing techniques, transportation systems, and communication technologies that might be adapted for Chinese use. The late evening hours brought private conferences with her most trusted advisors about the long-term strategic challenges facing Chinese civilization during a period of unprecedented international pressure and technological change. These discussions took place in intimate settings where participants could speak honestly about sensitive subjects that might be too dangerous to address during formal governmental proceedings. The topics addressed during these confidential meetings ranged from immediate military threats to fundamental questions about the compatibility between traditional Chinese values and modern international systems that operated according to principles derived from Western political and economic theory. Her advisors included both conservative scholars who advocated preservation of established institutions and progressive intellectuals who supported radical reforms designed to strengthen Chinese capabilities for competing with foreign powers. Her own position in these debates reflected the pragmatic approach that had characterized her entire political career. She remained committed to preserving essential elements of traditional Chinese civilization, while also recognizing that adaptation was necessary for survival in an international environment where military and economic strength determined national independence and cultural autonomy. Her questions during these discussions revealed sophisticated understanding of the complex relationships between political organization, economic development, and military capability that would determine China's future prospects. The midnight hours found her alone in her private study, surrounded by documents and maps that recorded the pulse of an empire struggling to maintain cohesion while adapting to revolutionary changes that were transforming the entire world. The oil lamps that illuminated these solitary work sessions cast dancing shadows across reports that described not just immediate administrative challenges, but fundamental questions about whether traditional monarchical institutions could survive the transition to modern international systems. Her personal library during this period expanded to include works on constitutional law, economic theory, and military science that had been translated from European languages by Chinese scholars who understood the importance of learning from foreign examples while maintaining cultural independence. The margins of these books were filled with her handwritten observations about potential applications of foreign concepts to Chinese circumstances and careful analyses of which innovations might strengthen imperial capabilities without undermining dynastic legitimacy. The maps that covered her study walls revealed the global context within which Chinese policy decisions would be evaluated and implemented. Telegraph lines now connected major Chinese cities with international networks that could transmit information across continents in hours rather than months. Railroad construction was beginning to integrate different regions of the empire, while also creating vulnerabilities to foreign military intervention if conflicts arose over territorial or commercial disputes. The financial charts that accompanied these geographical displays showed patterns of international trade and investment that were gradually integrating Chinese economic systems with global markets controlled primarily by European and American commercial interests. The challenge was to participate in these international networks sufficiently to access modern technologies and capital resources while maintaining enough independence to preserve Chinese political autonomy and cultural integrity. Her correspondence with international financial institutions reflected the delicate balance required for modernization without subordination. The loans and investment agreements that she negotiated provided essential resources for infrastructure development, while also creating obligations that could potentially compromise Chinese sovereignty if economic conditions deteriorated or international conflicts arose that required choosing sides between competing foreign powers. The winter of 1876 brought a series of crises that tested every aspect of her administrative capabilities and political judgment. Natural disasters in several provinces created refugee populations that required emergency relief efforts coordinated across vast distances. Foreign merchants were demanding additional commercial privileges that would further erode Chinese control over domestic economic activity. Most seriously, military commanders were reporting increased foreign naval activity along the Chinese coast that suggested potential preparations for renewed military intervention. Her response to these converging challenges demonstrated the evolution of her governing philosophy from reactive crisis management to proactive strategic planning designed to strengthen Chinese capabilities for long-term competition with foreign powers. Instead of simply addressing immediate emergencies, she began implementing systematic reforms designed to enhance the empire's resilience against future challenges, while also building foundations for sustained economic and military development. The educational reforms that she initiated during this period included establishment of new schools that combine traditional Chinese learning with modern scientific and technical subjects essential for industrial development. These institutions were designed to produce graduates who could serve as interpreters between traditional Chinese culture and modern international systems, while maintaining loyalty to Chinese interests and values. The military modernization programs that she authorized involved careful balance between acquiring foreign weapons and technology, while also developing domestic manufacturing capabilities that would reduce dependence on international suppliers during potential conflicts. Chinese officers were sent abroad for training in contemporary military techniques, while foreign advisors were invited to China under contracts that ensured Chinese control over strategic planning and operational command. The economic development initiatives that she supported focused on infrastructure projects that would integrate different regions of the empire while also strengthening defenses against foreign military threats. Railroad construction was planned to facilitate both commercial development and rapid deployment of military forces to threatened areas. Telegraph networks were designed to improve governmental communication while also providing early warning systems for foreign military activities. The diplomatic strategies that she employed during this period reflected sophisticated understanding of how to exploit conflicts of interest between different foreign powers while avoiding confrontations that might unite them against Chinese interests. Her negotiations with European representatives often emphasized the advantages that cooperation with China could provide in their competitions with each other for global influence and commercial dominance. The complexity of managing these multiple reform initiatives simultaneously, while maintaining political stability and dynastic legitimacy, required organizational capabilities that exceeded anything previously attempted in Chinese governmental history. Her daily routine expanded to include oversight of dozens of different programs that operated according to coordinated timelines designed to maximize synergistic effects while minimizing potential conflicts between competing objectives and resource requirements. The success of these comprehensive modernization efforts gradually transformed both her domestic political position and international reputation from embattled regent defending traditional institutions to visionary leader implementing innovative solutions to contemporary challenges. Provincial officials who had initially viewed her reforms with suspicion began to appreciate the practical benefits that modernization programs provided for their administrative effectiveness and career advancement. Military commanders who had questioned female leadership of military affairs were impressed by her understanding of strategic requirements and her commitment to providing them with resources necessary for professional success in an international environment where technological superiority often determined battlefield outcomes. Foreign diplomats who had expected to exploit Chinese weakness during another regency period discovered that they were dealing with a formidable negotiator whose knowledge of international affairs exceeded that of many of their own colleagues. The transformation of her public image during the late 1870s reflected not just personal achievements, but also broader changes in Chinese society's understanding of political leadership and governmental effectiveness during periods of rapid international change. The desperate circumstances facing the empire continued to create conditions where traditional restrictions on female political participation were subordinated to practical concerns about administrative competence and policy success. Her daily routine, as the decade progressed, settled into patterns that would characterize her leadership style, during what would prove to be the most transformative period in modern Chinese history. Each morning brought new opportunities to advance comprehensive reforms that were gradually strengthening Chinese capabilities, while each afternoon provided occasions to demonstrate the administrative excellence that justified continued regency authority despite growing pressures for constitutional changes. The palace chambers that had witnessed her extraordinary rise from powerless concubine to supreme authority now served as command centers for implementing policies that would determine whether Chinese civilization could successfully adapt to the modern world while preserving the cultural values and institutional frameworks that had sustained imperial unity for thousands of years. The decisions made within those ancient walls during these crucial years would echo through history long after the woman who made them had passed into legend. The 1880s ushered in what would become known as the Decade of Iron and Steam, as Cixi's modernization efforts began to bear fruit across an empire that stretched from the windswept steppes of Mongolia to the humid rice paddies of Guangdong. Her morning routine had evolved into a carefully orchestrated ballet of imperial administration, where every gesture carried the weight of governing nearly 400 million souls. She would wake each day to the sound of temple bells echoing across the Forbidden City, their bronze voices calling her to responsibilities that would have crushed lesser spirits. The tea ceremony that began each dawn had transformed into an intelligence briefing disguised as domestic ritual. Her personal servants, elderly eunuchs whose loyalty had been purchased through decades of careful cultivation, would arrange delicate porcelain cups while simultaneously delivering coded reports about developments across the empire. A particular arrangement of jasmine flowers might signal successful negotiations with German railway engineers. The placement of silver spoons could indicate concerning troop movements along the Russian frontier. Even the temperature of the water carried meaning, with cooler tea suggesting urgent matters requiring immediate imperial attention. Her chambers during these morning rituals resembled a military command post more than the traditional boudoir of an imperial dowager. Silk screens painted with pastoral scenes concealed maps marking foreign naval positions along the Chinese coast. Lacquered cabinets that appeared to hold ceremonial robes actually contained detailed intelligence reports about European industrial capabilities and American commercial ambitions. The ornate mirror before which she arranged her elaborate headdress reflected not just her imperial image, but also the coded charts hanging behind her that tracked commodity prices in international markets. The process of dressing had become a form of psychological armor preparation that would have impressed any general preparing for battle. Each layer of silk represented a different aspect of her complex identity as ruler, diplomat, and guardian of Chinese civilization. The dragon, embroidered across her chest, symbolized her authority over masculine institutions of government and warfare. The phoenix soaring across her shoulders proclaimed her role as protector of cultural continuity and dynastic legitimacy. The jade ornaments that adorned her elaborate hairstyle carried the accumulated wisdom of ancestors who had faced similar challenges during previous periods of imperial transition. Her breakfast chamber had been converted into what foreign observers privately described as the nerve center of Asian politics. The young Emperor Guangxu, now approaching his 10th birthday, would join her for these morning meals that combined family intimacy with affairs of state. She would explain complex diplomatic negotiations through stories that entertained a child, while actually preparing him for the responsibilities that would eventually become his alone. A tale about clever merchants outwitting foreign competitors might actually describe successful commercial negotiations with British trading companies. An adventure story about brave soldiers defending mountain passes could illustrate strategic planning for potential conflicts with Russian forces along the northern frontier. The morning audiences that followed breakfast had evolved into masterful displays of imperial theatre designed to project Chinese strength, while managing delicate international relationships that could explode into warfare if mishandled. The hall of mental cultivation would fill each day with a carefully selected mixture of domestic officials and foreign representatives whose interactions were choreographed to advance Chinese interests while maintaining the ceremonial dignity that legitimized imperial authority in the eyes of both traditional supporters and international observers. As the 20th century dawned and Cixi's remarkable journey neared its end, the woman who had transformed herself from powerless concubine to the most influential ruler in Chinese history could reflect on accomplishments that would have seemed impossible during her humble beginnings in Beijing. Her legacy would endure long after the last oil lamp flickered out in her private study, proving that extraordinary determination and intelligence could overcome any obstacle. Rest well, knowing that her story continues to inspire those who dare to dream beyond the limitations others would impose upon them.